It was a Thursday night in October. I remember because the leaves had just turned and the heating in the house was still making that noise. That clicking sound it made every fall when I switched it on for the first time. Ted had been buried that morning. Ted Harrington. 31 years in the same congregation, same pew. Third from the left on the deacon's side. We had been deacons together for most of that time, and before that we had been young men in the same church, and before that we had been boys who went to the same revival in Johnson City when we were 17, and both came home changed, or so we said, and so we believed for a very long time. I gave the second reading at his funeral. I shook his wife's hand outside the sanctuary and said things I believed, or said things I had always said, which is not quite the same thing, and which I was only beginning to understand was not the same thing. And that night, alone in the bedroom, I got down on my knees the way I had done every night since I was 17 years old. And nothing came out. Not silence like peace. Not the kind of quiet that sometimes settles at the end of a prayer and feels like an answer in itself. This was silence. Like a phone line that had been cut somewhere in the wall and nobody had told me yet. My mouth was open. My hands were folded on the edge of the mattress. And the words that had been running on their own for 50 years. Automatic, reliable, the most consistent thing in my entire life. Just stopped. I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes. Kneeling on the rug next to the bed where my wife used to sleep. The heating clicked. The house made the sounds houses make when no one else is in them. And I waited for something to restart, the way you wait for a familiar engine to turn over. Certain it will, because it always has. It didn't. That was the afternoon that took 50 years to arrive. Before I go any further, if this is landing somewhere real for you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I know that sounds like a strange thing to ask right here, in the middle of something this heavy. But what I have found is that this kind of content, the kind that names what people carry in private for years before they say it out loud, only keeps going when the platform understands that it matters. And the platform only understands that when you tell it. So, the like, the subscription. It takes 5 seconds and it allows me to keep doing this work, which is not easy work, and which took me a long time to be ready for. Now let me tell you about the math, because the math is where this particular story lives. 50 years. Not 50 years of thinking about praying, or intending to pray, or praying when circumstances seemed to require it. 50 years of nightly, private, spoken prayer, kneeling in the dark or sitting at the edge of the bed or lying on my back in the quiet of a house where everyone else was asleep, directing conversation at something I was entirely certain was listening. I started when I was 17, during a revival in Johnson City, Tennessee, that opened something in me genuinely and durably. By 19, I was leading prayer aloud in service. By 23, I was a deacon, which meant I stood at the front of the sanctuary on Sunday mornings and led the congregation in prayer the way you lead people somewhere you have been before and know the road. 22 years as a deacon. 35 years teaching history at the same Knoxville High School. A marriage that gave me 31 years before it didn't. And every single night of all of it. The prayer. In the morning sometimes too, and during lunch during the hard years, but always at night. Always. It was the most constant thing in my life. More constant than any job, more constant than any relationship, more constant, I sometimes think, than my own sense of who I was. And then, one October evening, after a funeral, in 20 minutes on the bedroom rug, the certainty behind all of it gave way. How do you explain that ratio? 50 years on one side, One Thursday evening on the other. I spent a long time trying to explain it through failure, through the assumption that something had gone wrong in me, that I had allowed something to erode that I should have protected. That's the first explanation the tradition offers, and it's the one I reached for first because it was available, and I knew its shape. If the faith is gone, the fault must be in the believer. The vessel cracked. The commitment thinned. Something was let in that shouldn't have been let in. But here's where the story turns. I was a history teacher for 35 years. That was not incidental to my personality. It was my personality. I spent 3 decades teaching teenagers in East Tennessee that the most important skill in understanding anything that happened is the ability to test a source against the evidence it claims to rest on. You don't accept a narrative because it's comfortable or familiar, or because the people you love believe it. You test it. You look for the document. You find the account that contradicts the official version, and you ask why the contradiction exists. You hold the inconsistency up to the light, and you don't look away just because the inconsistency is inconvenient. I taught that every working day for 35 years, and every single night I came home and prayed to something I had never once applied that same discipline to. Not because I was dishonest, not because I was choosing comfort over truth in some conscious, deliberate way, but because the 2 rooms of my life were sealed from each other. The classroom, where evidence ruled. The bedroom, where the prayer ran on its own, and I called that faith, and it felt like the most real thing I had. 2 rooms. 1 man, and for a long time the wall between them held. Now I need to introduce you to a name, because this name gave me the framework that finally let me understand what had been happening to me for years before I understood it. Leon Festinger, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota. In 1957, he published a book called A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, and the idea at the center of it is simple and it is brutal. The human mind cannot comfortably hold 2 contradictory beliefs at the same time. The contradiction creates a pressure, a genuine, measurable psychological strain. And the mind will do almost anything to relieve that pressure. It will change one of the beliefs. It will reframe the evidence so the contradiction disappears. It will discredit the source that's creating the problem. It will compartmentalize, if it can find the right wall to put between the 2 rooms. Festinger was describing the architecture of my interior life. Every time I encountered something in the biblical text that didn't fit the theology I'd been taught, I reframed it. Every time a prayer I said with complete sincerity produced nothing I could distinguish from the world operating on its own terms, I reframed that too. I was skilled at the reframing. I had practiced it for decades without knowing it was practice, and I did not experience it as dishonesty because that would require me to be conscious of what I was doing. This was structural. It ran underneath everything, like a foundation you never inspect because the house is still standing and you have things to do. But here's what Festinger also found. The reframing has limits. The mind can absorb contradiction, but not without cost and not forever. Every inconsistency that can't quite be dismissed, every prayer that ends in silence that feels heavier than silence should, every moment when the wall between the 2 rooms shows the faintest crack, all of it accumulates, not dramatically, not in any way you could point to and say, there. That was the thing. It accumulates the way water accumulates in the foundation of a house. Slowly, silently, until one October evening, the pressure is exactly 1 millimeter too large and the wall moves. That's what happened on the rug. That's what I couldn't see while it was happening because I was standing on the other side of the wall. Let me tell you now about something that the researchers who study this have found, because I find it one of the most clarifying things I have encountered since that October. There is a distinction, mapped by a team of German and American scholars studying deconversion across 2 cultures, between what they call the experiential dimension of faith and the ideological dimension. The experiential dimension is the felt practice, the kneeling, the spoken words, the ritual of address, the habit that runs every night like a clock that winds itself. The ideological dimension is the actual belief underneath it, the conviction that something is listening, the person on the other end of the conversation. These two things can separate, and when they do, they can stay separated for a very long time. Someone can keep the ritual of prayer going on pure habit, on the comfort of the structure, on muscle memory, and the shape of a familiar movement, long after the ideological foundation has already shifted, quietly, underground, without announcement. I had been doing that. The prayer kept running. Every night, the words still came, for years after the first real cracks appeared in the ideology underneath them. I did not know they were running on a different fuel by then. The fuel felt the same from the inside. The motion felt identical. The only way I would have known the difference is if I had stopped and looked directly at it, which I was not doing, which was perhaps the point. Until the night I got on my knees and the words didn't come at all, which meant the fuel had run out, which meant the ideology had shifted far enough that even the habit couldn't bridge the gap anymore. And the strange thing, the thing I still find strange to describe, is that the shift itself did not feel like a collapse. Not in the moment. In the moment, it felt like stopping, like a muscle I had been holding tense for 50 years finally releasing, and for just a moment, before I understood what the release meant, there was something almost like relief. Not peace, not happiness. Just the strange physical sensation of a tension you've been carrying so long you stopped registering it as tension, finally going quiet. The grief came later. The grief came in waves over a winter. But the moment itself was not grief. The moment was just silence. And then me, sitting on the edge of the bed, understanding for the first time what the silence meant. Now here's where Charles Templeton enters this story, and I want to be precise about why he matters, because he is not just a cautionary tale and he is not just an illustration. He is evidence that the pattern I just described is not idiosyncratic to me. It has happened to other people who were genuinely in it, not people who were pretending, not people who were never sincere, but people who gave decades and meant every day of it. Charles Templeton was one of the most prominent evangelical preachers in North America through the 1940s. He was Billy Graham's closest partner on the revival circuit. They traveled together, they prayed together, they preached together to crowds of tens of thousands. By many accounts, Templeton was considered the more gifted preacher of the two. He had devoted his entire adult life to ministry, and that devotion was not strategic or professional. It was total. And then he started asking questions he couldn't put back in the box. The problem of suffering was central. He described a photograph from a news magazine of a woman in an African village holding her dead child, and he couldn't make the theology hold against that image. The relationship between the scientific record and the narrative he had been preaching. The gap between what he proclaimed on Sundays with full conviction and what he couldn't stop thinking about by Tuesday. He talked to Billy Graham about it. Graham told him to choose faith over doubt, to trust where evidence seemed to run out. Templeton tried. He went to Princeton to study theology, hoping that deeper learning would close the gap. It didn't. The gap widened. In 1957, the same year, incidentally, that Festinger published his Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, which is a coincidence I find genuinely eerie, Templeton stepped away from ministry, publicly, irrevocably. After decades at the pulpit, after building a career that most ministers would have considered a crowning, complete life. And here is the detail that stayed with me when I first encountered this story. Near the end of his life, when asked in an interview how he felt about Jesus, Templeton paused and said he missed him. Not the institution, not the theology, him, the person. He said he thought Jesus was the greatest human being who ever lived and that he missed him more than he could say. That is not the testimony of a man who abandoned something hollow. That is the testimony of a man who lost something real. And it dismantles, very precisely, the argument that people who leave must have never really had it. You cannot miss what was never there. You cannot grieve what was never genuine. The grief itself, Templeton's and mine, and the grief of thousands of people who have written to channels like this one over the years, the grief is evidence of decades of real faith, not evidence of its absence. The institution sometimes calls the exit apostasy. What it actually is, in case after case, is the point where honesty became more expensive than the person could afford to ignore. But let me go back to the rug one more time, because there is something about that room I haven't told you yet. The rug was next to the bed where my wife used to sleep. She died 3 years before that October, and after she died, I kept praying, partly for her, partly in the hope that wherever she was, the prayer was reaching her somehow, which is a thing the theology I had was supposed to guarantee, and which I had never, in 31 years of marriage, examined as closely as I examined everything else. When she died, I leaned on that guarantee harder than I had ever leaned on anything. The nightly prayer became the only conversation I had in the house. Her side of the bed was there. The prayer was there. The certainty that somewhere she existed and could be reached, that was there. Until it wasn't. I want to be honest about what that particular silence cost, because I think it matters. It wasn't just the prayer that stopped. It was the last remaining conversation with her that I had allowed myself to believe was real. When the words stopped coming on the rug, I wasn't just losing the theology. I was losing her again, in a different way, in the way of finally understanding that the address I had been sending the letters to for 3 years might have no one on the other end. That's a different kind of grief than the one the deconstruction books describe. That's not the grief of losing a framework. That's the grief of losing a person you already lost, again. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. And then I did something I hadn't done in years, which is I just sat in the silence instead of trying to fill it. No prayer, no theology, no reframing. Just the house, making its sounds, and the heating clicking, and October doing what October does in Tennessee. It was the most honest I had been in a very long time. Now here's what the research shows about what was happening inside me during those years before October, because I think this is the thing that might reach someone who is still in the middle of it. Still showing up, still kneeling, still saying the words, but feeling something different in the room than used to be there. A longitudinal study published in 2024 tracking personality change across hundreds of people before and after religious conversion and deconversion found something that cuts through all the easy explanations. The length of the commitment itself, the number of years spent inside the faith, the depth of the integration. That length is the single strongest predictor of how dramatic the exit feels. Not weak commitment producing drama, long commitment producing drama. The longer you were in, the more of yourself you built inside the framework, and when the framework moves, more of that self has to be renegotiated simultaneously. 50 years is not a small number. 50 years means that the question of God was woven into the question of who I was supposed to be, into the question of what the death of my wife meant, into the question of what I was doing when I stood at the front of a congregation and said words I meant. All of those questions lived inside the same framework, and when the framework moved, all of those questions moved with it, at once, on a Thursday evening in October, on a rug next to an empty side of the bed. This is why I keep saying, it was not a failure of commitment. It was a consequence of it. A very long, very genuine commitment, examined finally with the same honesty I applied to everything else. I want to spend a moment on something the tradition says about people in this position, because I think it deserves a direct answer. The argument is from 1 John chapter 2, verse 19. They went out from us, but they were not of us. the implication being that anyone who leaves the faith was never genuinely in it to begin with. That the exit proves the absence of real belief from the start. I understand why this argument exists. It protects the institution. If everyone who stays is genuine and everyone who leaves was never genuine, the institution is never confronted with the possibility that genuine, decades-long, costly faith can honestly arrive at a different conclusion. The definition is arranged so that outcome is impossible by construction. But it is not true. It is what a philosopher would call a definitional move, a way of protecting a conclusion by excluding the evidence that contradicts it before it can be admitted. The people who write to forums about 50 years of genuine practice, about morning and evening prayer, about deaconships and mission trips, and marriages blessed in the sanctuary, and children baptized, and parents buried with the full weight of the liturgy. Those people were in it. Their entire adult architecture was built inside it. The exit was not evidence of absence. The exit was the point where the architecture and the evidence diverged so far that the honest thing was finally unavoidable. Honesty is not apostasy. Sometimes they look the same from the outside. They are not the same thing. Now let me tell you the last piece of this, which is the part I couldn't see in October but which I can see now, or at least see more clearly. Spinoza, who is, for me, not a conclusion, but a thread I kept pulling, Spinoza understood something about the relationship between the human need for God and the question of what God actually is that has stayed with me since that garage sale copy of the Tractatus changed the shape of my reading. He was not trying to destroy faith. He was trying to understand it honestly, and what that honest understanding cost him was everything. The synagogue, the community, the language his family spoke, the name by which his God was addressed. He was 23 years old when he was expelled. He was excommunicated with a ferocity that the historical record preserves in precise, furious detail. They didn't just exclude him, they cursed him, in a language designed to make the exclusion total and permanent. And he kept writing, not to hurt anyone, not out of contempt for the believers, but because the question mattered more to him than the cost of asking it honestly. The question of what God is, stripped of everything the institution needs God to be in order to function. The question of what the text actually says when you read it with the same discipline you bring to any other document. The question of what it means to live honestly inside a universe that does not explain itself. Those are not comfortable questions. They are not questions that make the nights easier. They do not replace the prayer with something warmer. But they are the honest questions. And after October, in the winter that followed, they were the only ones I could bring myself to sit with. I have not replaced the prayer with certainty. I want to be precise about that, because I think it matters. I have not arrived at a clean, confident atheism that makes the questions easy in the other direction. What I have arrived at is something more uncomfortable and more honest than that. I don't know. I do not know what was listening, or if anything was. I do not know what the silence means. I do not know where my wife is, or whether the word where even applies. What I know is that the words that used to come automatically on the rug no longer come, and that I am no longer trying to force them, and that there is something in that, in the willingness to sit in the silence instead of filling it with words that don't mean what they once meant, that feels to me, at 67 years old, like a kind of honesty I should have been practicing all along. The prayer was real. The 50 years were real. The grief of that Thursday night was real, and the grief of the winter that followed was real, and the grief I still carry about my wife and about the address I no longer know how to reach her at. All of that is real. And so is the silence. And so is the strange, uncomfortable, unresolved peace of sitting in it without flinching. I want to close with something I didn't expect to arrive at, which is this. I am not angry at the faith I had. I have met people on the other side of deconversion who carry a rage at the institution, at the years spent inside it, at the cost of the exit. I understand that rage. For some people, the institution caused real harm, not just intellectual confusion, but social rupture, family fracture, the loss of community that was their entire world. I understand why that produces anger. But for me, and I want to be honest that this is my story, not a template. What I feel most often when I look back at 50 years of nightly prayer is something closer to sorrow than anger. Sorrow for the version of me that was kneeling in the certainty that the words were reaching someone. Sorrow for the conversations I thought I was having with my wife after she died. Sorrow for the architecture of meaning that I lived inside for so long, and that I now live outside of. But not contempt, not mockery, not the need to convince anyone that they should be outside it too. Howard, the person I've been my whole adult life, still teaches. He's just teaching himself now. And there's something else I've come to understand, which is this. The silence I found on that rug was not created on a Thursday in October. It had been there, underneath, for longer than I could precisely name. The October night was only the night I stopped being able to not hear it. The two rooms of my life, the classroom and the prayer, had been slowly equalizing in pressure for years, and the wall between them had finally grown thin enough that the sound came through. I think about the students I taught. 35 years of teenagers in Knoxville, most of them from the same kinds of homes I came from, most of them carrying the same assumptions about the universe that I had carried from Johnson City. What would I have told them if I had known then what I know now? Not what to believe, not what to discard. Only this. Ask the same questions of the things you hold most dearly that you would ask of anything else. Not to destroy them, but because the things that are real will survive the questions, and the things that survive the questions are worth more than the things you protected from ever being asked. That is the lesson I should have applied to myself. That is the lesson October taught me. 50 years late. And if you are somewhere in the middle of this, still in the habit, still kneeling, but feeling the pressure of something shifting underneath the words, I want you to know, you are not broken. You are not weak. You are not failing at faith. You might be, for the first time, paying attention to it with the discipline it deserves. That is not a small thing. That is the largest thing. I want to ask you something specific in the comments, and I'd like you to try to answer it honestly if you can. Tell me about the moment, not the collapse. The moment before the collapse. When the words were still coming, but you knew, in some part of yourself you were not quite ready to name, that something underneath was different than it used to be. I think more of us have stood in that exact moment than ever say so in public. I would like to know what it felt like for you. I'll read every single one. Before I finish, a word about what this channel costs to make. Not in money, though it costs that too, but in the willingness to say things in public that most people only say to themselves in the dark. The super thanks on this video is a way to say that this kind of work has value, not as a transaction, as a recognition that honest, careful conversation about what faith actually costs, and what leaving it actually costs, and what the silence on the other side of it feels like, that conversation deserves to continue. You have been here for the whole of it. You are why it continues. Take care of yourselves.